second panel on the Housing Bill. And we have Susie McCluskey, Change Lead, All In for Change; Heather McCluskey, Implementation Lead, Centre For Homelessness Impact; Sarah Rogers, Senior Policy and Public Affairs Officer, Families Outside; and Shay Moran, Senior Representative, Off the Street. So thank you for joining us today. And we will move straight to questions. So the theme in a general sense is, to what extent do you agree with the Scottish Government's overarching policy objective of the homelessness measures in the bill to create a shift away from crisis intervention to prevention activity? And I think I'll go with Heather first of all. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, Centre for Homelessness Impact absolutely agrees with policy intention. That shift from a crisis response to homelessness to a more preventative response needs to happen. I think the key to the success of the bill will be a well-planned and well-resourced implementation. And also early engagement and support from local authorities, as well as relevant bodies, ensuring that prevention duty does shift to other organisations that aren't the homelessness team, that it doesn't just become a duty to refer, will be really key. We also, in a more sort of wider overarching point, we also need to understand more about what works to prevent homelessness. We don't actually have a lot of evidence, a lot of robust, well-evaluated evidence around what works. And we see this bill and the implementation of this bill as a real opportunity to grow that evidence. And if in the implementation, we can fund some pilot areas that are evaluated independently. We can grow that evidence. We can understand best what works, and we can be able to put our resources into those areas in a better way.
Thanks, Heather. I'm now going to invite Shay in if he wants to make any comments on that.
Yes, thank you. We would certainly agree with the objective in principle. And we would add that an attempt to shift away from the perpetual crisis response mode that we've been in for quite some years now is, in fact, essential, and to move towards a more preventative model instead. We have decades of research now which shows us the consequences of not having an adequate focus on prevention, whether that's negative effects on physical and mental health, disruption to education, placing young people at risk of abuse and violence, and other issues which can continue on well into later life. We are yet to be convinced yet, though, that the bill, as it currently stands, as written, is the correct vessel to be able to achieve these aims. I personally worked on behalf of Off the Streets to ensure young people with lived experience had representation in 2 youth homelessness prevention pathways. On the Prevention Commission, which came up with the Ask and Act principle and worked alongside the Prevention Review Group, and also on the Prevention Task and Finish Group. All of these groups produced quite comprehensive final reports which laid out exactly how we would like the Scottish Government to tackle prevention in this bill. And as it stands, I believe that the bill currently falls a bit short, or quite a bit short, of the expectations we had, and could be far more ambitious in its scope. Shifting our focus to a more upstream prevention methodology will see benefits in reduced homelessness presentation in the long term, but will also see long-term savings across multiple sectors. But as far as youth homelessness is concerned, there is not enough in the bill that aims to address the unique routes into homelessness that they often see and the unique circumstances they find themselves in when faced with homelessness.
Okay, thanks. I don't know whether Sarah or Susie would like to make any comments on that.
Yeah, I would like to come in.
Yep, thank you.
So, All In for Change, we absolutely agree with the homelessness measures that's in the bill. what we really want to do is push for that culture change. You know, if this is shared responsibilities, we need everyone to be buying into this. We need everyone to be around the table. And I think perhaps that the scale of this culture change is maybe being overlooked. It takes years for legislation, you know, to take effect, and what we need to really think about is the housing emergency as it is right now. We're very limited in the options that are available for people right now. So if we're heading towards prevention, we need to have a menu of options that are available to people, and that allows us to then really look at that, moving away from crisis and heading more towards the prevention work that we really need to do.
Thanks, Susie. Sarah, would you like to make any comments?
Yes, so at Families Outside, so we are strongly supportive of the overarching policy objectives in the bill. I mean, I think it's really clear there is an urgent and a pressing need to move to this prevention model. And we do think that the provisions of the bill have a real potential to actually drive this shift, bearing in mind, of course, the issues around implementation, resourcing, capacity, housing supply that I'm sure we'll come on to speak about. But our key concern with the bill is that we don't know as it stands if it's actually going to make a tangible difference on the ground for families who are affected by imprisonment. And that is largely due to the fact that families affected by imprisonment, they're very much a hidden group. And there's a real lack of awareness of the damaging impacts of imprisonment for families across our public services, including specifically the issues that they experience in relation to housing. And I'm just going to briefly touch upon some of those issues just to give a bit of context there. So, for example, imprisonment is associated with huge financial hardship for families. So, very often families can find when someone goes to prison, there's a drop in the household income, but then that also comes with huge costs in supporting the person in prison. And we explored this in detail in our Paying the Price report that some of you may be familiar with. So those costs can just make it very difficult to continue to meet housing costs. Another issue can arise where the person in prison has been the tenancy holder or where they've been the main claimant in terms of universal credit or housing benefit, and that can end up putting the family home at risk. Another sort of situation that's quite specific to families affected by imprisonment is that they can sometimes find that they are actually forced out of their family home and out of their local communities because of harassment and targeted attacks that they receive in their home due to the crime that their loved one has been involved with. And finally, another quite specific issue that we encounter is that families can often look to be rehoused because they're wanting to be closer to the prison that their loved one is placed in. Quite often, people in prison, you know, they're not in a prison that's near the family home, and we've looked at this issue in depth recently. The costs, the logistical, geographical issues involved in then trying to maintain that relationship is a huge barrier. So families are looking to be rehoused. So if there's not an awareness amongst our services about these specific challenges, what our concern is that families affected by imprisonment aren't going to see the benefits and they're going to basically fall through the cracks of the legislation as it stands.
Okay, thanks very much, Sarah. I'm now going to invite Kevin Short in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to the panel. First of all, if I could turn to Mr Moran, because he stated very clearly that the working groups that he was involved in, the Voices of Lived Experience, feel that there are elements missing from the draft bill. Would you like to expand on that, Mr Moran? What do you think is missing? And is it actually legislation that's required for the change that you're seeking? Or is it that cultural change that Ms McCluskey mentioned in her opening remarks?
I think that the cultural change that's required definitely cannot be underestimated. But I feel that, and the young people that I work with certainly have indicated that up until now, we have had too many quite disparate systems all working towards trying to achieve this aim of prevention. And from one local authority to the next, from one service to the next that an individual is interacting with, the results can be vastly different. And in some areas, prevention is still very much light touch. There are some fantastic examples of good practice that we certainly need to be carrying forward, but I feel that we need to have a very candid discussion about where the failings are in the system and the legislation that we currently have, so that we can try and carry forward that learning and come up with a more streamlined, universal model that can be applied to all public bodies or relevant services equally.
So I wonder, Shay, if it is failures in the legislative framework, or is it interpretation of the legislation by certain bodies as it stands that is not right? And is there something you think we could do with this new piece of legislation to make sure that the kind of uniformity, the best practice that you want to see is exported through good legislation, regulation? Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, to the first point, I would say it's a mixture of the two. There are certainly failings in the legislation. I think that up until now, the legislation has come from too many different avenues, and it hasn't always quite closely aligned with the overarching objective we have had to prevent homelessness. As to what could be changed, I believe our issue at the moment with Ask and Act isn't so much the principle and the idea that we're going to legislate it. It is more so the fact that at the moment it is very unclear how in practice Ask and Act is going to work. We would like to see more of a robust take on it in the legislation and the supporting guidance, fully informed by the reports of the Prevention Task and Finish Group and the Prevention Review Group, to try and design this more uniform system. I believe, though, that it does need to come from a legislative standpoint, as up until now, as we have seen, leaving things open to interpretation, as you have said, has resulted in far too many people slipping through the cracks and there not being an adequate understanding of exactly how people are affected by homelessness and their routes into it.
Thank you. I could probably ask you about what you mean by robust, but I'd probably better leave that for just now, and you can maybe give us an indication afterwards around about what you would like to see in terms of that robust action. If I could turn to Ms McCluskey briefly around about the culture change aspect, because we all know that you can bring into play some excellent legislation. We've heard earlier on from witnesses around about us having some of the best homelessness legislation in the world. But it doesn't necessarily, in practice, work for everyone. What do we need to do to underpin this new legislation in terms of that cultural change? What do you think that we should be asking public bodies to do in terms of ensuring that culture change?
Okay. I think training is massively important, and by that I mean for public bodies to have a really good, solid understanding of homelessness. And if we're looking at prevention, public bodies need to understand that what are the signs of homelessness. So it's moving very much away from that person sitting in front of you and they're at crisis, and it's looking very much further back and thinking, is there, because there's a change of income, is that going to then lead to something else? And it's just being a wee bit more understanding of the issues when they first begin, and not having to then act on them at a much later date when you are very limited with the options that you can do anything with.
So I don't want to put words in your mouth in any way, shape or form, but one of the things which I find when folk come to me with a problem is often the initial problem that they come with is not the real problem at all. And I do what we call the delve to find out, what is the underlying. Is it that kind of aspect that you're talking about, that further delve into asking folk what the real difficulties are? And beyond that, you talked about training. Do you think, for example, there's enough trauma-informed practice training on the front line to actually, get folk to do that delve and to understand what folk are going through?
So to go to the first part about the kind of question, I think how we ask is very important. The language that we use is very important. We talk about being trauma-informed and trauma-responsive, and we really need to have that put into practice in terms of it's not just about the training. We need to go much further than that. I think we're all aware, of the damage and the trauma that homelessness causes. So with public bodies and that shared response, we want to be able to find, areas that are problems for people, identifying, right, how can we step in now?
Yeah.
What can we do? And I think relationships are massively important as well. So when we talk about this like cross-sector culture change, relationships play a massive part. I think we also want to acknowledge the part that communities play. We have lots of smaller organisations out in our communities who are doing amazing work. And there's probably not a lot around about the third sector input within the bill, and I would like to see, or we would like to see, more of that within the legislation and the guidance.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, that's lovely. Now moving on to the theme of the Ask and Act, Justine, I'm going to invite Paul O'Kane in. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to the panel. And I suppose we are interested to get your views on the Ask and Act duty as it's defined in the bill. And I suppose perhaps the place to start is building on some of the previous contributions about how things work currently in terms of trying to prevent homelessness, and in particular, I think, the relationship between third sector organisations and homelessness services within local authorities. And really, do you think that the new proposed statutory Ask and Act duties will actually help to address some of the issues and create better areas for improvement? So I appreciate that's quite a broad sweep, but we are keen just to get your initial views on all of that. So happy to... Susie, do you want to start? Just because you're closest to me, I thought we'll go that way. So.
Perfect. Data sharing is a massive barrier. It has continued to be a massive barrier since it was implemented, and that is something that we really need to address. So if we are taking this culture change and this move towards a shared responsibility, we have to get the data sharing right. There is still a fear around data sharing and what can't be shared, and then what's happening is we are not sharing anything and then nothing is getting done. So we're missing the opportunities where we can really intervene. So the data sharing is massively important. I would also like to add that we are not starting from scratch around the prevention work. We have RRTPs, we have lots of pathways, there's good work happening in prisons, we have work happening for residential rehabilitations, and it's about learning what's already happening out there and building on that good practice.
Would anyone else like to contribute? Heather?
Yeah, I'm so glad, Susie, that you mentioned data sharing and data integration, because I think that's really key. It's really key to involve relevant bodies and to also help us understand what the roots in and what the roots out of homelessness are. We have really separate data at the moment. So we have homelessness data, we have health data. There's very little meeting in between, and so it's very hard to understand how people travel, particularly from being at an early risk of homelessness to going into the door of their local authority homelessness department. So along with culture change, we also need a shift towards much greater data integration, which will help us to share and help our practice. It will also help our understanding. And Susie's also absolutely right that we have really great examples of preventative services. What we would argue for, and as a research organisation, I'll always argue for this, is more robust research into what the impacts of these services are, and it is with that greater understanding about what the outcomes and what the impacts of particular services are that we can make the best decisions with how to allocate resources.
So data, again, just picking up on that, and is a huge issue in relation to families affected by imprisonment. So, as I've said, families, they're a hidden group, and part of that is the lack of awareness, but part of it is the lack of data, because at the moment we do not have data, we do not have numbers. There is no systematic process in place at any stage of the criminal justice process that captures who these families are. So what that means in terms of this bill and sort of prevention is it's very difficult for public services to be trying to act in a preventative manner because they don't know who these families are. So how can they be reaching out to see if they're needing help with any issues? What they're relying on is families actually identifying and reaching out for help. And I don't think it can be overstated how difficult that is for families affected by imprisonment to do. The stigma that is associated with it, along with the fact that issues, say, in relation to housing, are likely to only be one of many issues that they're facing. It makes it very complex for them to know where to start to look for help. And that's also compounded by the fact that at no stage in the criminal justice process is accessible information and advice actually forthcoming for families. If I could maybe touch upon the second part, I think it was of your question as to could this bill, could the Ask and Act actually improve things here? We think there is potential because whilst families aren't really on the radar of public services, they do come into contact significantly with agencies throughout the criminal justice process. So to see within this bill that the police and the Scottish Prison Service are named as relevant bodies is hugely promising. And obviously it's really important that they are named when we're looking at supporting the housing needs of those individuals who are directly involved in the criminal justice system. But we want to try and ensure that they actually have a role in relation to families, because at the moment our experience is that these agencies don't really have any direct engagement with families in terms of seeking, do they need support, do they need referred on? But they could potentially with this bill. What we need to look at is, how would that work in practice? It's not necessarily an easy answer, but we need to be looking at trying to tap into the interactions that families have with the criminal justice agencies and trying to make sure that questions are being asked and that they are then being appropriately supported or appropriately referred on. And we think the Ask and Act duties have the potential to do that. But at the moment, it's not entirely clear if they will do so on the face of the bill.
Okay, thank you. Shane.
I feel like my colleagues on the panel here have already covered much as to the first part of your question, but as to the second part as to how this could actually improve outcomes, or if it will, I believe that a large part of that will come down to the training and guidance that is provided around Ask and Act. At the moment, I believe that some of the issues that we have, or many of the issues that we have, are the lack of general knowledge around what homelessness is, what it looks like, and how it affects different groups of people in very different ways. Speaking for young people specifically, we know that many of them are disproportionately likely to be affected by hidden homelessness, and many of the young people that I interact with, it wouldn't be too much of an exaggeration to say that they do not realise themselves that they would classify as homeless and be entitled to support. A large part of what will be required from relevant bodies in Ask and Act is themselves being able to identify, not just by asking, is your housing situation stable, but a range of other factors as well, and being able to adequately identify the various warning signs and knowing what method of acting would be the most appropriate within that circumstance. I believe that unfortunately up until this point there has been quite a large focus on the referral aspect of acting. Personally, we would like to see that as a separate duty from Ask and Act, as almost a follow-up. Our belief is that if we are relying too much on referrals to a housing body within a local authority, then we have already failed to prevent homelessness. All we have done is streamlined the process for someone to reach that stage where they are making a homelessness presentation, which completely undercuts the entire principle of the Ask and Act section of the bill.
Okay, thank you. Those helpful contributions. In the previous panel, we had a discussion about the need for resourcing with the bill, because we appreciate that that is a challenge. So I wonder if it would be possible just to get a view on how Ask and Act can be implemented and the sort of resourcing and financial implication that will be associated with that. Obviously, the government, I think, intends to make, or says in the bill, it should be about upfront investment and sort of, investing at this end in order to preventative, I suppose. And it would be just to get your sense of will that happen? Do you think that will happen, and what further needs to happen? I think particularly for those who are interacting with local authorities and those funding structures as well. Yeah, Sarah.
We wouldn't sort of comment on whether or not the cost of detail in the financial memorandum are sufficient. We're not sort of experts in terms of the housing issue, but what we think there really needs to be account of, and it's been alluded to a few times, is the training. And actually that is going to be a significant amount of resources that are going to be needed for that. And it's about recognising that that training and awareness isn't just training and awareness in relation to these are your duties. I think it's been mentioned about actually really understanding homelessness and understanding how that differs for different groups. And so obviously from our perspective, there would need to be that understanding of the roots in, the circumstances that families affected by imprisonment specifically find themselves in, because without this, for our families but also for other particular groups, there's a real risk that their needs are just not going to be understood, recognised, and they're going to continue to be unsupported.
Heather, and then...
Yeah, I'll just come in briefly. I think there's my microphone going on. Yeah, I mean, we fully agree that there needs to be upfront investment to ensure that this is really adequately well implemented. We can look towards Wales and England, who have prevention duties, and see that in implementing those, they needed to provide significant upfront investment on training, on hiring new staff, in order to be able to fulfil these new duties that they had. And those duties were very different in Wales and in England, but we can certainly learn those lessons that they did need significant investment in that. We would also, again, I'll make this point, argue that we need some investment around pilots and looking at what works, around developing those really, that list, that menu of options of what does an effective intervention look like? What does that action look like that relevant bodies can take? And what can local authorities do more to push the prevention work that they're doing more upstream, and truly prevent people from moving into homelessness, from getting to that point where they're needing to go into temporary accommodation, potentially staying there for years.
Okay. Thanks, Kavita.
Thank you. And sticking to that theme, I'm now going to invite Bob Doris in. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everyone. Just a couple of brief questions. There's obviously specific bodies listed in the bill that will have the new Ask and Act statutory duties placed upon it. Are those the right ones? And what role is it for third sector organisations in helping implement those Ask and Act duties? So, right organisations, how can the third sector contribute to you?
So I would say that the list at the moment is a good start, but we would certainly recommend expanding on it. For instance, I'm aware that at present there are certain bodies which are grouped under the kind of heading of local authority within the text of the bill, such as education. We would recommend that these bodies are explicitly mentioned within the text of the bill, just to make it entirely clear that they will be subject to the Ask and Act duties. Ideally, we would be saying that educators, social workers, and essentially anyone who falls under the corporate parenting responsibilities should have the Ask and Act duties applying to them explicitly. With regards to other bodies, I would say that the third sector will certainly have a large part to play in the successful implementation of Ask and Act, as far as creating the cultural change that will be required and fully supporting it. Many people, their first interaction where they feel comfortable disclosing that they might be at risk of homelessness will not be with a health worker, an educator, or someone from justice. It is most likely going to be with a local community centre, youth centre, someone within the community that they already have that rapport there. There needs to be adequate routes in place to allow these bodies to be able to refer people into the correct services that will be kind of covered by the Ask and Act duties.
Can we just go along if that's okay, Sarah?
So we were particularly pleased, as I said, to see the police and the prison service included, and do think that the list at the moment is a good starting point. The fact that the bill does allow for that list to evolve, I think, is very much welcome. In terms of the role of the third sector, I mean, we would agree it is absolutely crucial. Obviously, there's many third sector organisations already working in this space, working with service users. And I think, as Shay pointed out, they're often the ones who have these trusted relationships with individuals, and that could really be key to ensuring how they experience the interactions with the statutory services that they're going to have to engage with. I think as well, third sector is quite often already working very well with a lot of the relevant bodies. So from our perspective, we have very good relationships with the prison service already. And we need to make sure that we're building upon these and that we're valuing, I suppose, these partnerships. And I think what's really important is third sector, like everybody else, are very stretched in terms of resources. So if they are going to be taking a role in the bill, that we're looking at making sure that that is appropriately resourced.
That's very helpful. Heather, before I bring you in, I'm going to throw in my next question because of time constraints. So if you can maybe reflect on that as well, that would be very helpful. So yes, anything more on the Bodies for Asking Act, of course, we'd like that. But how do we make sure there's an enforcement and accountability framework that's meaningful, substantive, but not overly bureaucratic, I suppose? So any thoughts on that as well? So if I throw it at the end there, Heather, but it might be a very similar view we're getting in relation to the bodies from all the witnesses. So that additional question as well.
No, thanks. And I don't have very much more to add on the relevant bodies beyond what my colleagues have already raised. I think as it stands, the bill doesn't go into much detail on what Ask and Act will look like or how it will operate. Nor does it say anything about enforcement and accountability. So there's a bit of a hole there. I think it will be important to have really clear and practical guidance for local authorities and for other relevant bodies about how to act and when to ask about homelessness and what actions might be taken. And you know, again, those actions should be well informed by evidence around what works. And I'd also add to that it will be really important to have a monitoring framework in place. And in terms of data integration, that data and sort of indicators from those other relevant bodies should be included in that monitoring framework. So this Ask and Act duty is not just about the local authority and their performance around homelessness, but rather around what, as a society, all of us are doing around preventing homelessness.
It's very helpful because the local authority current statutory duty is the easy bit to count, if you like, and analyse, but things have went wrong by the time you get to counting those numbers. So that's
absolutely. It's really hard to count and to measure prevention, but we need to have a monitoring framework.
Okay, so the government's going to have to sharpen up its thoughts on how we do that. Susie, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. We feel that the list could go on, and it could involve partners from DWP, Social Security Scotland, and just to give an example, in South Ayrshire we have really good working relationships with our local job centre. So on occasion, if there's been a change in income, and they can already identify that there's risk of homelessness, certainly change to income. They would then make contact with the relevant parties, so whether it be the Housing Advice Centre or whether it be our Housing Options team. And from that, there's like that kind of wraparound support that's needed for that person, so that that risk is then very much minimised, and there's opportunities to then move on and totally avoiding having to go down that homelessness route. That's just an example of why we need to maybe think beyond the list that is currently there as the bodies. Just to answer the question on the enforcement and accountability, it's not really clear about what this means for both public bodies and local authorities, and at both parts, the Ask and the Act. So we need much more detail around that to know what that's going to look like. And I think what's really important is the initial pick-up point of when identifying somebody. That party should then be part of that person's journey. So we talked about personal housing plans at previous committee meetings, and I think that's really essential so that everybody is very aware of where that person is at that point in their journey, and they can very quickly get the right support around that person. Thank you.
That's really helpful. And I won't ask any more questions other than just to reflect very briefly, Susie. I think you're suggesting, we heard last week as well, Convener, that whether this Parliament can put a statutory duty on an organisation to have that duty or not is one thing, but if they should be involved, we should at least have some kind of voluntary arrangement with them. We'd heard about the Home Office, we'd heard about GPs previously, and you've said DWP. I'm just making sure there's no any other organisations that you would like to just put on the record. I won't come back into any more questions, but any more organisations that you might quite like to see on the record in relation to that duty. No.
Is this for me?
Okay.
No.
If anyone, just make sure, because I won't get back in. Is there any other organisation this is your opportunity? Can I say just now so it's on the official report? That's all. If there's not, that's fine. Okay.
I think just to add, the Job Centre was mentioned there as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. And Social Security Scotland as well. Okay. Thanks for that, Jeremy. Okay, so moving on to the next theme, which is preventing homelessness sooner. I'm now going to invite Jeremy Balfour in. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, panel. Thank you for coming this morning. What are some of the problems with the current legal framework which considers people to be threatened with homelessness within 2 months? And obviously the bill is now suggesting 6 months for people at risk of homelessness. I'd just be interested to get your views on whether the 6 months will make a difference. So can maybe just work along the road, just start with you, Shay, and work along if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. I mean, certainly, as has been mentioned at previous sessions, by 2 months, somebody is already in crisis and prevention becomes exceptionally difficult. Moving further upstream to a 6 months away from homelessness model will certainly help, but we have concerns about the implementation of it and how it is currently worded within the bill. One of the issues with the current system is that the enforcement of it is counterintuitive to the spirit in which it is intended, where people presenting as homeless, say 9 weeks away from becoming homeless, will be told, we cannot help you until you are 8 weeks away or 2 months away, so you will need to come back then. We would recommend altering the wording of the bill so that rather than 6 months, it says at least 6 months away from homelessness. But we also have some serious concerns about how this is going to be evidenced by people and where the burden of proof is going to lie. Many young people that we speak to, and this will also apply across the board, and I believe it was mentioned in the earlier session, do not know if they are 6 months away from homelessness, and they do not know how to demonstrate this. And in many instances, unless they can provide proof, they will be unable to receive support. If we are moving 6 months away from someone becoming homeless and trying to really focus on prevention, many of the young people that I work with have concerns that if they are still within, say, the family home or living with a carer or a guardian, and attempt to present to their local authority to receive housing support, they will be required to provide proof from their family who they are having issues with, that they are at risk. And this can then compound the issues and ultimately be the trigger that leads to them becoming homeless. Ultimately, we are unsure at the moment with this kind of overarching issue around where the burden of proof lies, how effective 6 months away from homelessness is going to be. We generally believe that the only people who will have any true benefit from it are, say, those leaving prison with a set date for their release, or care leavers who have a set date for when they will be essentially leaving care.
Lead on to Sarah.
So I would agree with what she said in terms of the concerns around how is 6 months going to work in practice. But to look at some of the positives that it will bring, it does definitely allow for more scope for there to be that preventative approach and to hopefully allow that multi-agency working that the bill is obviously seeking to bring in. And with that, it should be that we can then get that more holistic approach. So 6 months, I know it's still not a huge amount of time, and we'd agree that it should be at least 6 months. But if we've got that extended time period, then we should be able to start looking at some of these wider issues that are going alongside the risk of homelessness. Again, that is all coming down to, though, is it going to be appropriately resourced? And just to pick on something else there in terms of where there will be situations where it is possible to plan further in advance, and one of them being for somebody who is in prison. Something that I've not touched upon here, I've sort of spoken about the issues that families face in relation to homelessness, but families also play a really crucial role in preventing homelessness for the person themselves who's involved in the justice system. So we know that in terms of pre-release planning, that at the moment they're not often meaningfully involved in that pre-release planning, or at least not consistently so. And what can happen is they're often the place that the person in prison is actually leaving, going back to that family home. And if they've not been involved in that planning, and then they're not being appropriately supported after release, you're putting huge strain on that family relationship. And what we can then sometimes find is actually, because of that lack of support, the relationship's at risk of breakdown when the person has been released, and then that person is then at risk of homelessness. So if we're bringing families more involved into that pre-release planning, then we can avoid some of that for the person who's leaving.
I think that there's a real benefit in extending a duty to 6 months before homelessness, or at least 6 months before homelessness, because it does have the potential to shift that focus away from crisis response, which is what we have at the moment, to that real preventative work. And we know from Wales and from England, who have a prevention duty, that prevention work can work and does achieve positive outcomes in a lot of cases. So our caution is more about where the delineation is around when the prevention work goes on and when it moves into the homelessness pathway. So when you transfer from being at risk of homelessness to threatened with homelessness or experiencing homelessness. And I think the bill could have a stronger definition of what those are and what they look like, and perhaps that would also help to answer where the burden of proof lies as well. It sounds counterintuitive, but we would also argue potentially for separate teams within local authorities to be working on this, to really clearly separate what that prevention duty is and when it ends, and indeed within relevant bodies, what that prevention duty is and what the homelessness duty is as it exists now. And when each of those duties are discharged as well.
I think what we are essentially talking about here is a window of opportunity, and 6 months should really be the minimum. When you're thinking also around transitions, there needs to be a focus on that. As my colleagues have mentioned, young people leaving care, people leaving prison. We also want to be thinking of those that are leaving residential rehabilitations for drug and or alcohol addiction. We also want to focus on hospitals, colleges, universities, areas where there could be that increase in activity. We also want to ensure that the support services that are on offer are adequate, they're adequately resourced, they are providing up-to-date accurate information in terms of housing advice, and we want to make sure that support that is on offer is meaningful support, and it's really there to support the person, because at the end of the day it's about the people and what we are doing for the people in terms of prevention. Thank you.
Thank you. Just following on from that, then, I wonder if anyone has comments about the proposals in the bill. As part of a local housing strategy, councils should undertake an assessment of people, housing support needs and the availability of housing support services, including in relation to homelessness. Anyone? Yeah, sure.
We would absolutely welcome this change. All I would maybe add to it is that as part of this, we would really need to be moving away from the almost stigmatising view that homelessness is just a housing issue. If we are planning on including some sort of guidance to expand on how local authorities' housing strategies are kind of constructed, we would also like to see other factors such as health included within that, and the wraparound needs that come with supporting someone through their journey through homelessness. Yeah, ideally.
Thank you.
Okay. Then moving on to then the next theme, which is on domestic abuse. I'm going to invite Marie McNair in. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. I'm looking to seek your views on the Bill's provisions that aim to prevent those at risk or suffering domestic abuse from being homeless. And I'll pop it out first to Sarah, if that's okay.
So we definitely welcome the provisions. We do wonder how they're going to join up with some sort of existing schemes and existing policy frameworks. And one particular issue that's come to our attention from families that we support is how it might potentially link with the victim notification scheme, because we're aware of many instances where survivors of domestic abuse haven't been informed timelessly of somebody's release, and where that might have had an impact on them feeling they are at risk of abuse and perhaps looking to be rehoused. So I think we need to make sure we're looking at basically how it joins up. If it's not, then these duties that are coming in, to act sooner and so on, they're not really going to bring any real benefit in that sense if we're not making sure that all the systems are working together.
Anyone else? Chair?
I mean, similar to Sarah, we absolutely welcome any additional provisions that will protect people from the risk of domestic abuse. Our issue is we were quite disappointed to see that there were several things missing from the bill that we would like to see included. I know that in previous sessions the private rented sector has already been highlighted as something that ideally should be alongside the social housing kind of provisions within the bill. Young people are already significantly, disproportionately disadvantaged within the private rented sector, and I've had several young people highlight to me that they are concerned that not having adequate provisions in place for them would force them into a situation where they are stuck in a home with an abuser purely because they do not have an option if they move out, and given current wait times across Scotland to find social housing, it could cause several issues as someone newly presenting there. There were also no provisions to account for domestic abuse taking place within the family home, which we would like to see maybe something being done there alongside what is currently within the bill.
Anyone else? Susie?
So I think, Willing for Change, we absolutely welcome the provisions and the need for a housing domestic abuse policy. I think the key will be in the detail and the quality and the robustness of how the policies will be implemented. We also need to acknowledge that, again, it's like the prevention side of things. We want staff, and colleagues to feel confident that they can approach this subject, but in a very caring and sensitive nature. So if you think about how we delivered the routine inquiry, in terms of the questioning around about that, there is maybe something to learn from how we implement that around the domestic abuse, and maybe take that further and use that in terms of the questioning around about prevention and kind of housing, stability. Domestic abuse is not always visible, and I think we'd heard that earlier on from colleagues, and it can be, it's a really complex situation, and I think we're probably aware that, it can take 7, 8, 9 times for a person to actually physically leave that relationship. So there needs to be that kind of offer of support from the very beginning, and that continued support. And I'm aware that there's safe plans are established through kind of Women's Aid and Scottish Women's Aid, and I think that's maybe something that we want to also consider when we're talking about personal housing plans, that is very much a key factor in going forward with the domestic abuse part of the policy.
Cheers. I was going to bring you back in, Susie. Heather, do you want to... It's just really My next question was really, I wanted to direct specifically to yourself. It was in terms of just want you to expand on a point you made in your submission about some parts of the bill seemingly contradicting each other, such as measures of ending joint tenancies and measures to address domestic abuse. And obviously you kind of touched on the additional costs associated with ending the tenancy. So if you could expand on that, that'd be great.
My colleague Shay had mentioned before about the private rented sector. There seems to be that gap. There isn't a lot of guidance or anything around about how that's going to be delivered in the private rented sector. So to give an example, if there's a relationship there and it's a private rented property, as it stands just now, it would be about ending the tenancy, but there would be kind of like notification, and it would be still liable for 2 months. And that, to me, is kind of essentially trapping somebody in that property. And we maybe need to look a wee bit around about how do we make sure that that person can leave safely, and then not be subject to like rent arrears or anything that's going to impact them on future housing if they were to access the private rented sector again.
Cheers. Back to yourself.
Okay, thanks very much. And on the last theme, which is on equalities issues and impact on rural areas, I'm going to invite in Ros McCall. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. It's still morning. Yep. Two points, really. One on rural, one on the equalities side of this. So, from your perspective, the equality issues, have they been properly looked at? Have we got them involved in here? The previous session, they found out they didn't think the consideration was being taken. So, from your perspective, you could give me an idea of what you think on the equality side of the bill, and we'll just work our way down. So, Susie, if we could start with you, and we'll work our way along. Thank you.
Thank you. All in for Change would absolutely welcome the idea of a equalities impact assessment, and I believe other witnesses have called for that previously. This needs to be done in a trauma-informed and sensitive way in terms of how we make people feel safe when disclosing any sort of housing risk. And when I'm talking about that, I'm meaning more around the groups and the impact assessment. There are pilot projects that have are going on across the country, and I think it's fair to say that for some groups they feel safer going to the community-based pilots and programmes and work that's done in the communities rather than maybe going to the statutory services. So again, it was just bringing back in the idea around the third sector and how important the role that they're playing in this. Thank you.
I'd echo my colleagues' calls for an equalities impact assessment. But I would also highlight that we don't currently gather information around some protected characteristics. So in our homelessness statistics, we don't currently gather information on sexuality or transgender identity. This is something that is as part of the review for Scottish Government data. They're going to add this, but it won't be for several years that it actually comes into effect. We also don't gather very good data around disability or support need. So my answer to this around how it will affect equalities issues or how people with protected characteristics will be affected by this is we don't really know very much about it, and we need to get better at gathering data in order to know. We also need to get better at gathering that data so that we know much more about routes into homelessness, particularly thinking about LGBT people and routes into homelessness. We know that they are at higher risk of homelessness and perhaps have different routes, different causes and consequences of homelessness.
Okay. Thank you.
So we would agree again about an equalities impact assessment, but what we are keen to emphasise is that actually consideration needs to go beyond the protected characteristics, because some of the groups, including families affected by imprisonment, who are particularly vulnerable and do need specific consideration, they're not going to be captured by that. So we need to make sure that we're not, as I've said, allowing them to fall through the cracks. So we can't limit it to only the protected characteristics.
Thank you. And Shay.
I would agree with all of the points that have been made so far. I would only really expand on it just to say that we know that there are many groups that are already massively overrepresented within homelessness through not necessarily government statistics, but statistics that have been gathered by third sector organisations. We know that young people are hugely disproportionately represented within homelessness statistics year on year and have been for a very long time. Care leavers, LGBT young people, young parents, all of them are overrepresented within the figures that we currently have. The full extent, though, is hard to really measure because we haven't to date really been capturing any of this information. I feel that this also applies to the domestic abuse provisions as well as the homelessness provisions, where for LGBT young people, we know from third sector organisation research that has been done over the years that over 50% of LGBT young people experience domestic abuse from a partner, and over 60% of them have witnessed domestic abuse within the family home. None of this is really adequately reflected in the bill at present, unfortunately.
Okay. Thank you. The other part of my question is on rural. Again, looking at the differences, and we know, and we've had a lot of evidence that what is happening urban, what is happening in rural are two different things. So can you give me a sort of an indication from your aspect? Are the homelessness issues in rural taken into consideration, and have we got it right, and how are we looking at the ability to tackle this? And we'll come round down the other way, if that's okay.
I would say that the main area where the consideration is lacking at the moment probably comes down to the fact that in the financial memorandum there is no budget currently allocated for training of frontline staff. I believe that in rural areas this will cause significant issues just based on the responses we've had from young people that have said that they would not feel comfortable disclosing their risk of homelessness to staff within rural areas purely because of the limited number of services and the kind of closed communities that they exist in. We heard several examples from young people who did disclose their risk of homelessness and quickly found that this information had made its way around quite a small community and made it back to the people who were putting them at risk. We would also say that for young people especially, although this applies across the board, access to services within rural areas is a significant barrier, as well as access to housing that is offered. We heard several examples from one local authority, rural local authority, where people were offered housing by their housing team, but it was on the opposite end of the local authority from them, and no assistance was provided as far as how to actually access that, or no consideration was taken into account as to how this would cut them off from support networks, their work, or any of these other factors.
Thank you. That's interesting. Sarah? I
think we would only comment in respect of the fact that we know that families affected by imprisonment who are living in rural areas do experience sort of unique issues. One of them is in relation to visiting, so as I said, that can pose issues in relation to housing. So again, it's just an issue that needs to be considered.
I bring it back to the implementation of the duties around prevention and thinking about setting up and funding pilots to find out what works around preventing homelessness, and that those should be done in rural areas, in islands, and in more urban areas.
Okay, thank you. Lastly, Susie, got anything to add?
Yeah, I would like to. The provisions in the bill don't seek to address specific issues in rural areas. And rural areas will face different challenges to urban areas, as we know. I think there's a thought around public transport, travel costs, and I think it's fair to say that digital inclusion should also be added into that as well, because that is also a factor for people in terms of accessing online information or accessing online support. Again, I think the importance of the community-based organisations, if we have those already established in rural areas, then let's look to them, and bring them round the table when we're talking about prevention in rural areas. The relationships are there, the trust is there, so it's a really key part of making sure that this bill, works and is implemented well.
Thank you. Yeah, that's been lovely.
Okay, so that now concludes our second evidence session, and I want to just say thank you for all your contributions today. So next week we will hear from the Scottish Government. So this concludes our public business for today. And